Hey everybody, this is Carlos Ocelot, founder and CEO of G2 Esports, former professional gamer, and wonderful bodybuilder, as you may have known. Of course, you know me for that, pretty sure. And you're watching Dan Can's channel. Thorin, my man. Enjoy.
I would say, just personal opinion here, you have a very strong brand in esports, actually. I feel as though even if people, fans themselves aren't obviously reflecting on this as often, so maybe they wouldn't know how to describe it or whatever. But if I think about the space that you occupy, the kind of the respect, it seems like you're pretty universally liked in all the regions. I don't tend to see a lot of people, even though you cast LCK, calling you biased in the way they do to people like LS, Monty, are obvious examples. An area that there's obviously very strong contrast between the two of us is the way I tend to deal with things is, it's just to let people behind the veil for a second, is I'm willing to take any amount of public hit if I still get what I want to happen or what I think should happen to take place, basically. I'm like the equivalent of, I won't use a particular notorious example, but let's just say a businessman who doesn't particularly care how it's perceived as long as he gets the deal at the end, as long as the right thing happens and he gets what he needs to pursue the business.
And justify the means?
Well, I would never say that personally. I have a very strong set of principles, but I would just say that, I don't mind what the consequences are, essentially. Sure. If the end goal is worth it, I will accept the consequences that come with it. Whereas actually, I don't know how much this ties into some of the things about your personality. With your brand, it seems like you've been fairly cautious with how you've slowly built it out. And you haven't really, as far as I can tell, aside from the Riot move with the MSI, you haven't really made many aggressive moves or really called people out or kind of been in many battles. So how have you crafted this brand? Is it something that you've been conscious of?
I think I've just tried to be me at all times. And I'm not, I have a strong belief about justice and integrity. And I would never do or say anything to impugn my integrity. So I will never lie to the fans and I'll never do anything like that. But I also, like you, have a similar kind of moral compass and strong belief on how things should be done and how to make those do. I just feel like we have different methods. I have been someone who looks at trying to appeal to public opinion on a topic that I'm, invested in, let's say. I try to only appeal to public opinion as either a kind of gauge of interest or as a last resort. I have strong belief in my ability to directly speak to people and be convincing in my arguments. And I tend not to feel strongly about things unless I'm very confident that I have a position that, by position, I don't mean like job title, but like an actual opinion / want for what I feel like should happen. I feel like it's going to be something that I've thought a lot about, and I very much feel like I have the support to recommend it. And I'll go directly to them respectfully and try to kind of engage in that context, and then try to set things up positively for the future. And if it's going to be something that really is like injustice will occur, then I will go public because that's what needs to happen. But so far, I feel like I've been able to kind of use the context I have and the good relationships I've made to be able to achieve my ends. But I won't lie to you. There's been multiple heated debates I've had with Riot and other stakeholders where you're sitting there being like, I really hope this goes this way. Otherwise, I'm going to have to maybe, press that button or say something publicly or potentially blow up a relationship I spent many years on. It's not always you're not always going to perfectly align with people. I'm not a yes man. I just, at the end of the day, so far have been able to kind of try to focus on the things I feel really care about and push them, and largely doing those without the same kind of public chats. That hasn't been necessary. But thankfully, I guess, for my own conscience, the way I always look at it is that I do everything with the hopes that the next day I can wake up, look at myself in the mirror and be proud of the decisions I made and the things I chose to do. And I think, there's been some bad days, but I feel like mostly I've been able to do that through my journey. So the fact that I've done that with strong relationships and stuff, that wasn't my strong public opinion. That wasn't my goal. I haven't made all my decisions to lead people to like me, but I've just tried to be me. And the fact that that's happened along the way is kind of a feather in my cap, but not something I kind of spend a lot of time thinking about.
One area I want to ask about in terms of persona and how it interacts with like your choices you make in your career is when you criticize people, especially like we're not just talking like you're criticizing a great player and his small weaknesses. Sometimes there are very flawed players, or there are players in slumps, or even worse, sometimes someone in a game does something that is just almost on an objective level silly. Like the move they do is a brain fart. They do something that even a pro player on their level wouldn't do. And in this moment, it's very easy to be very harsh. It's very easy to be very critical. You can even you mock them, deride them. Now, to be fair, there's an element to which people like me and Monty, when we've been known to engage in this particular manner, first of all, it is authentic. Like, we actually are, as people, just unabashed elitists. Like, I really am the sort of person where if I like a certain genre or something, I like the absolute best stuff and everything else is garbage as far as I'm concerned. It's just gradients of garbage. I don't care. Like, I actually tell people, I've told many pro players in Counter-Strike this, I'm not actually trying to be mean, mate. I genuinely don't care about almost anything that happens outside, say, in my game, I can be more at least, say the top 10 teams. If you're in the 15th best team, you're an underdog to me. I know you're in the 15th best team in the world. To you, maybe there should be a different perspective. But to me, it's why aren't you in the top 10, basically? And I'll always kind of view you in that contrast. And I think an added benefit it has, I would probably be like that anyway, is, to be fair, that sort of contrast can actually make it more sharp as to who you think the best players are, because then people see it's more stark, as to this person's revered, he's incredible, this person's not as good, right? In your approach, I notice you do a great job with the other part. You give people the props and the great players, you acknowledge them. How do you deal with the other part, though? Because it seems like you're not as harsh in the criticism angle, and I certainly am nobody to judge whether you should or shouldn't be, but I want to know, what's your perspective? How do you kind of apply that aspect?
I would say that I do it in the way that kind of fits my personality, and that, like, the reason that I feel like Monty and I were able to do Eurocast and why I thought our TriCast was strong is that Monty, like you, very much had this is non-standard. I know what is standard and why that's standard, so this must be bad because that was available. Why didn't you do that kind of approach? And I was always kind of let's discuss what this does. Let's assume these people are not dumb and try to work out why they did it. With the conditional information that they had and whatever prep they had. And then we already know what's better. We've talked about it. Let's give it the time. And then after it's over, we can look back and say, okay, well, you tried this, but like we talked about with that, this is definitely not as good as what we originally thought. So next time, don't do that. That's kind of how my brain has always worked, is to think about how each person involved's perspective works and try to use my understanding of the whole to kind of intuit why they tried it. Give first the benefit of the doubt to the pro player where possible and say, this person's not brain dead, so why did they try this? And then evaluate it honestly afterwards. So I've just got a different take and turn on things. And I think over time I've changed. Like, I'm definitely someone that, one of my biggest kind of weaknesses as a caster when I started was I was so afraid of how I would be viewed in terms of like whether I knew my stuff or not, that I would add a lot of conditionals to statements, so that I ended up being ultra safe about what I said. Because I'm always someone that I don't want to, as a professional, represent the wrong opinion. I want to be like, this is it, and this is all the parameters, and these are the asterisks. But then when it comes to commentating, like, you need to be snappy and you can't be too verbose. And I'm someone that's definitely, even to this day, a verbose caster, but I've tried to sand off some of those comments and accept the fact that it's fine to face plant sometimes just for the benefit of the broadcast. And even when it comes to criticism, like, I'll still be myself. I'm still, all right, what we trying here. But as long as I feel like I'm being genuine, I just try and do it my way, and again, be more positively framed rather than negatively framed, because I remember that it's an entertainment broadcast, and so there's fans on both sides. So when someone needs to be destroyed, I will destroy them. But as a whole, I try to always be first positive and then give out the negative afterwards, which is just a kind of a tendency I've taken. And I understand if that makes people think that I'm, like not being harsh enough and things like that. Like, I think there's plenty of clips of me just ripping into people when I'm like, look, there was no reason to do this. Literally, there is no presenting information. You should have come to this conclusion. Therefore, you stuffed up. And I will still do that plenty of times. But because I'm always in general, okay, but why did they do this? And like, okay, let's try this. I think that over the summation of my career, it comes across as that I'm kind of less critical. But I think people's opinion on how critical I am does vary, because I feel like I'm happy with what I put out there, and I never say something's good if I don't think it's good, but I do give time to things because I want to learn more. You know what I mean? Like, it's a totality of information decision that I make rather than really any other kind of decision.
As you alluded to earlier, early in your career, you weren't someone who was like a naturally like bobbly person who had high energy and any of these things that you might even think would be natural talents that a commentator would be aligned with to do the job, because a lot of people think you're on camera, you know, you must want attention. Yep. Right. This is something though that people have seen over the last few years. It would appear, at least, you've put a lot of effort into. Like, you've obviously now you've even been doing the whole branding of like who's your papa and stuff, like trying to do more of a light-hearted comedic element and almost a little bit of swagger to it. I'd even say is kind of the whole point, right? So what was this something that you've also consciously worked on? Is it something that's developed as your life's improved? How's it gone?
I think there's multiple kind of streams to it, but I remember I did my first couple of broadcasts in Australia after being out in the wilderness for a while. So like, you know, coming back as a full-time caster. And I would always seek feedback from everyone. Like, we had a Riot producer there. We had my co-casters. My mom watched as well. And she was like, you don't smile enough. And I'm like, but mom, like, I'm the expert. Like, I'm trying to be, you know, get the information out there. And she's like, no, but you need to smile more. And like, that made me think about it. And I tried to soften my eyes as well. People said I had, I don't know if I can say this term on that broadcast, but I had very harsh eyes, let's say, rather than kind of welcoming eyes. So I had to change that because, you know, I wasn't very self-confident and I hadn't done anything like that before. So I had a lot to learn in terms of presentation. For context, I lost 50 kilos in a year. So like, that does shift kind of, like, you don't update with your updated, as your body changes. If you change a lot and you've been overweight a lot of your life and then you're more kind of within the normal range, your brain doesn't update instantly. You know, there's a lag there where you still in your head think you're the same person you were for 25 years before, you know? So that sort of stuff was hard. And there was a lot to learn there about how to present myself. Cause I just used to, like, you know, not want to be photographed and stuff like that before. So I had a lot to learn around that. And then you wanted to, like, prove that you knew your stuff. So that obviously was your first focus. But I guess the time when I got more and more active about it was when Monty and Doa left, right? They finished working at OGN at the end of 2016 after I just done my first Riot event. And I obviously got feedback from Riot being like, hey, like, you need to work on your how you present yourself on screen. Because like, I was pretty good at commentating League of Legends and analyzing, but I wasn't very funny or entertaining at the end of the day, like, or super engaging, especially in terms of using body language. And then Monty and Doa left for Overwatch League. And so I realized that we were losing our calling card because the LCK broadcast was the broadcast that Monty and Doa were on, and they were the stars. And if Papa was on, you were a bit sad that Monty wasn't there, you know? Like, at the start, you were infuriated. A year and a half in, you were like, I mean, like, he's fine, but like, I really wish Monty and Doa were here to talk about whatever it was that week. Star Wars is the obvious one looking back, but whatever, like, philosophical or pop culture thing. They had a vibe, and that, you know, that wasn't my broadcasting. My broadcasting was very much trying to talk about the game and then do my best to be entertaining. But losing that, I knew the fans were, if I didn't really look into self-improvement and how to adjust, I knew the fans were going to say, look, I don't hate PapaSmithy. Like, he's pretty good. Like, I think his analysis is pretty good, but I just miss Monty and Doa's banter, and I just miss what they brought the broadcast. And like, people were going to miss Monty and Doa one way or the other. Like, they had been there literally for the entire rise, mostly casting 100% of games with Choba doing play-by-play for a little bit, for a long time. And so I was the one who looked at that, and we didn't have a producer or, you know, a team to address this issue or a content plan. I was just like, okay, well, I'm going to be the face on this, so I need to be the one to work this out. And so my natural sense of humor is pretty dry and pretty reactionary. Like, I'll make an observation, or I'll have an offbeat take, or I'll have some like black humor or noir kind of humor. about things. That's not always kind of the right broadcast vibe. Like you need to be a bit more exuberant usually on broadcast. But my natural was to like, someone else would say something funny and then I'd like push it a little bit, would be kind of my way of doing humor. But I wasn't someone who was like active about, I just didn't have the self-confidence to be that kind of person. But I knew that Achilleos, who was going to be my duo partner with Monty and Doagon, was also that kind of person in terms of humor. So there just wouldn't be that much humor on the broadcast or off-topic discussion if I wasn't going to be the one to change. So I said, nope, I know exactly what the fans are going to want. I know exactly what LCK English's brand is and what it was before and what it could be or should be or will be in the future. And I need to anticipate that in order to make sure we still provide the level of product the fans deserve. Because that's what I care about the most, is that I want the fan base to get the content, the side content, the broadcasting, etc. they deserve, much more so than any kind of personal stake in it. My personal stake is kind of, I've spent half the lifetime of the LCK, a little bit less than half now, watching as a stream viewer, and then got to broadcast the other half. Like it felt a lot like the LCK English broadcast, my magnum opus. So when I said before there was no product owner, I felt like de facto, like I had to be the one to decide what the direction was going to be and what the narrative would be. Like we didn't have any meetings or stat team to prepare all that. So alongside all that prep, I challenged myself to be the one to get out of my comfort zone and try to be more of what was going to be lost with Monty and Doa leaving. And don't want to be someone I'm not, but I'm going to need to, at the end of the day, elevate my natural tendencies a bit more and try to be more conscious of what it is to be an entertainer and what it is to be a persona. Like at the end of the day, and DeFisher and I found this at the same time, there's diminishing returns to how much hard analysis research you do actually improves your broadcasting analysis, because you could know everything about League of Legends but not be eloquent in explaining it. And it didn't matter how much information you had in your head. If you couldn't say it at the time, it might as well not have existed, right? So I realized that the diminishing returns of getting into the weeds on rewatching VODs and like going even harder at analysis had started to come. But the amount I could improve in terms of on-screen and entertainment, which are very important part. Like delivery is so much of being a caster, even over and above kind of like the minimum level of knowledge required, that I just decided, okay, let's turn the kind of hard analysis knob this way a little bit. Doesn't feel good as someone who like prides themselves on knowing the game, but I have a lot of growth potential in trying to be an entertainer and try to be interesting. And I feel like it's something I could do with the time if I really set myself for. And I know it's something the product needs, because we're not going to get it from Monty and Doe. We don't have them to fall back on anymore. So I'm just going to do everything I have. And if I fail trying, then at least I tried it, And so that's why I just tried. And, I don't get to decide what the results are, but mostly I get the good feedback from it. So I guess this is me now, for better or for worse.
I don't know if you've talked about this particular topic in interviews or not, but at one point in time, before you came to LCK, as far as I know, you had a fairly serious offer on the table to be a coach and to actually get involved in that side of the game. Like, can you give us any information? I don't know if you've ever addressed it publicly. Can you tell us anything about that and why that kind of road was never the one traveled?
Yeah, I've had offhand stream comments about it, but I guess in a more formal setting, it's interesting. I was offered in I want to say it's early 2014, late 2013, maybe early 2014. I forget. It was in 2014, regardless, to coach Cloud9. I guess
this is the classic era, right?
This is like
and Balls and all those guys.
Yeah, it was the old lineup still. I forget. No, it was the old lineup. And I had reached out. Jack had reached out to me, or maybe Monty had put him through. I forget how the connection happened, but they were very interested in bringing me on as coach. And they were reaching out to me to make that happen for 2015, it would have been, or maybe late 2014. But basically, The visa part was tricky because obviously we were in a slightly different time when it came to P1 visas for esports, for coaches especially. And I still had the burning desire to be a commentator. Like that was my first choice because I was already kind of 27 years old at this point, and I looked at coaching as something that was a lot more risky because the turnover, and there weren't even that many professional coaches back then.
Sure.
So there was a lot of risk about it. And it's a big move to North America and things like that. Like certainly there were parts about it that interested me, and Cloud9 from kind of minute one was a great org, right? So at least I knew the org would have been a wonderful one to get to work with. And that team had just won back-to-back titles, I think, at the time. I think they was spring, like they had won 2 titles. I think it was like summer 2013 and spring 2014. My NA history is not as good as my Korean history, but that sounds right to me. So there was appealing parts about it, but because I had put that gap year towards becoming a commentator, like I was very clear with Jack, like, hey, like this is my main focus. And I don't think commentating in general was the reason that fell through at the time, but at the end of the day, like for whatever reason, it didn't happen. They offered me the job again twice, and then are you happy with commentating? Like Jack would just reach out and hey, are you happy with commentating? Like we would still love to bring you on. And I was happy with commentating, it turned out, as a full-time job. And then eventually Jack reached out and said, hey, we're looking for a coach that speaks Korean. Do you know anyone you could recommend? And I had met Reaper a couple of times because he was a mutual friend through Susie. And I knew that he spoke a bit of English. And I knew that he had just finished up with EDG and was looking to coach another team. So I recommended him, and that obviously they took him on as a trial, and Jack asked me to come in and basically kind of watch scrims and give me feedback on what I thought of Reaper's coaching. And he was really, really promising from the start. And they had a great translator with him to paper over any of the English decisions and kind of set him off on his career there. Like obviously that's a match that still exists to this day. So I was very happy that even though I was never able, at times able, other times interested in being Cloud9 coach, I was able to set up a good process there. So I have a lot of respect for C9. They make a lot of good decisions along the way.
In your own context as a color commentator, you're obviously a bona fide expert about the game and could absolutely coach the analysis side of the game, basically, as is typically what became coaches initially. But a part that people might not be aware of is, since you have this background as a psychologist, was that also something that you would have applied and tried to make kind of your angle as a coach?
I think it definitely was the main reason Cloud9 was so interested, apart from like a good reference from Monty, was the educational psychologist side, because a lot of the skills that you use in being a psychologist, on a simple level, like on the simplest level, an educational psychologist is you show up to a school, meet an at-risk kid, whether he's in a bad personal situation or not doing well at school or whatever the case, and then very quickly need to be able to build rapport with that kid and then get them to tell you stuff they may not even admit to themselves or have told anyone. Like that's like, it's a pretty, like, to actually get that to happen is not a trivial process, right? Because people don't like to share what's in their mind, and we don't have any technology to be able to draw things from people's minds directly, right? So I'm good at rapport building. It's one of my strongest personal qualities is the ability to kind of put someone at ease and get them to speak openly and honestly. And then also I have a lot of understanding about kind of workflows and all the other realities of educational psychology. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about performance coaching and what setups would look like and how I would interact with that. So I feel like I have a pretty natural skill set from educational psychology and the game. And especially at that time, like this is before like someone like Weldon had a pretty similar path to me in terms of his background. Like I think he has maybe more higher education than me. I had a 5.5-year degree. I think he has more. But like we came from similar paths. I think he's a little, at least when I had known him, he was a bit more theoretical than me. And I was trying to be a bit more practical because I had to kind of wear a lot of hats being a regional psychologist, because they didn't get a lot of support where I was 3.5 hours away from a major city. So I had to do a lot of different things. So I couldn't just stick with the textbook as much. But yeah, I felt like I had a pretty kind of perfect core skill set for the time. And I'm still confident that that's a job I could do. Like, I got very deep. I've talked about this publicly as well, that Origin wanted me to be head coach of them for this year. I would have got to work with DeFiscio as one of my closest friends. So that was another job I kind of tried on at the end of last year. But there's definitely thoughts about working on the organizational side, because I feel like, I've achieved a lot in casting, and there is always that potential that a position out there exists that would be the fusion of kind of my first love, which is like, why are people the way they are? How can I help out young people, kind of educational psychology, and also kind of like broadcast and analysis of League of Legends and stuff. But there is definitely a Venn diagram where certain roles would make sense. And for a long time, I seriously considered the coaching staff, but it just didn't work out in the time.
There's a couple of teams I wanted to ask you about, historical teams, just
Sure.
within the context of that you've cast a lot of the games of these teams, and so you know them somewhat intimately in that regard. Now, I understand you've mentioned it yourself. You don't always have all the dates and stuff off the top of your head. It's not going to be like that. These are going to be teams that you absolutely will know a lot about, and as I say, they pretty much are part of the furniture if you follow LCK. So,
sounds good.
One of them would be obviously the SK Telecom dynasty. And I'm talking specifically your era here, the LCK era, not the first one with all Pumandu and Piglet and those guys. The era when it was the similar core, and then they took out pieces which often even look quite similar pieces and brought them in and continued their success year on year. Because the thing I always find interesting about this is I noticed that when fans look into the history, they often have, I would say, a flawed element to their perspective where they feel as though whatever happened is like it had to happen that way. So, for example, if you win, you were always going to be the champion. You were probably always the best. The way I would describe it, I think the way I would model this to make sense to people is, if you go back in time and you look how many championships SKT won and how many worlds they won and how, like, pretty much by and large, they just won nearly all the time. Yeah. It'd be very easy to look back and see the dominance and think, right, they must have been, 80-20 favourites in some of these matches. And it's like, no. If you go back, actually, what was amazing was sometimes they might have been a slight favourite. Sometimes they were maybe even an underdog in a tournament and came out and won it anyway. So obviously this is an incredibly difficult question, but this is what they pay you the big bucks for. What do you think were the hallmarks or the qualities that made SK Telecom the dynasty that kept getting over the top in this sense and kept getting the big prize, whereas obviously they had rivals, they had peers who, some of them might have been more talented, some of them might have seemed like it was their time. There's something special about this organization, this dynasty. So what would you say, what would they be from your perspective?
Question I was asked the most throughout my career was always kind of, why does Korean dominance exist? And to some degree, like, why is SKT always so dominant? And there's no 100% right answer, right? Like, I felt like I had a different answer each time, but none of them were, fully right or fully wrong. They were just kind of musings on what I saw. But I guess the consistent factors of SKT, on one side, like, Faker was so dominant in his role for especially 2015 and 2016. He was so far away from the second best Korean mid laner. It was Kuro could never handle Faker until much later in his career. That I think that was obviously a very big reason for it, and especially those 2 years. But I think people romanticize some of that era in terms of how dominant SKT were, kind of, especially domestically, because there was multiple passages where they had kind of bad runs of domestic form, but would potentially go on and win the final, right? Like, the ROX Tigers were much more domestically dominant in regular season in 2016. In 2017, there were some issues as well, trying to get that roster together. And it was kind of a miracle they made World Final with how bootstrapped they were by the end, where Huni could only play super aggressive top lane picks in a meta where that wasn't really the right way to play, because if he wasn't just running it down with pressure, they would just lose. And he couldn't play the TP tanks as the meta needed enough with where their series was. The thing about Huni was, when he came on, he could play Poppy Maokai stuff, but by the time World Final rolled around, the meta had evolved a couple of times. They really didn't have any playstyle apart from him kind of zombie pushing for pressure. That was obviously the famous Faker's Galio is just dominating everything. How are they even here? Kind of moment for them in 2017. to me, the only like SKT was super duper hard dominant. Like this is a comment that I think we disagree upon is who is the best team of all time. To me, it's 2015 SKT by far. And that's one of the hardest times to evaluate because the overall talent pool had been drained the most recently. It's 2015. But 2015 summer SKT, you know, the team that went, 17-1 at Worlds or 18-1, whatever it was. They dropped one game. I think they are the strongest League of Legends roster that's ever existed, that could be easily evaluated. Like, obviously, because there's a lot of people that have watched recently, like, who's to know what G2 will accomplish, for example, but with any measurable kind of team that we can look back on that hadn't kind of reached their peak and fallen away, like 2015 SKT were the ones where they were regionally ultra dominant in summer and also like went on to be super dominant at Worlds. So to further answer your question of why SKT, I think the talent, you know, the Faker element is very relevant. I think the fact that they had the unchanging core of Faker, Bang Wolf, and then kind of the revolving door top laner and slightly revolving door jungler, but the settled coaching staff as well. Because they played this reactive macro style that never really changed because their warding was smart and they obviously had some good understanding of fundamentals. I think a lot of it was that they had a settled core with settled fundamentals of how to play the game. And while they would periodically reinvent themselves in terms of like the champion pools would change, a lot of how they approached the game was very similar. Like the thing that's lost on people is if you make the SKT era 2013, 2015 to 2017, 2013 SKT was a very different team to 2015 to 17 SKT. Like 2013 SKT was vibrant. They did have Faker play assassins to pick people. Famously, they came up with Pumandu playing support Mordekaiser for no real reason apart from flexing, as far as I can tell, in their first split. That they were a very different beast in 2013. But 2015 to 17 were all about the calculated aggression, all about the safety first plays, smart wards, and the counterpunch. Like they were really a counterpunch team. And they were able to be that because while the meta changed in terms of champion pool, it could always be extended into team fights when you know your power level and the enemy's power level. And SKT were very good at siphoning that information towards the end of a patch, because remember, they were also very bad on new patches and at picking up new, like whenever the patch changed, ROX Tigers were instantly the best team for a week, and then SKT would take 2 weeks to catch up. And the same was true in international tournaments. And it kind of felt like that filtered into pro games as well. Like they were a team where if they got ahead, they knew how to close a game. And if they fell behind, they knew how to extend a game with wards. And that only changed in 2018 when the metas changed and also their talent level clearly fell away in terms of the roster they put together in 2018. But the consistency of what wards and map control and how to not overextend in the mid to late game was actually pretty stationary for so many years in a row there. And that seemed to be what was SKT's bread and butter and what didn't change, even if the pieces changed and the early games changed around it.
Another team, it was the ROX Tigers, and I'll just preamble by saying one of the things, like basically the two things I often narrow down that my obsession with esports basically stems from, and quite frankly just loops back into, it doesn't expand too much, is I love the great winners. I want to see the people with the absolute best who accomplish the things no one else can do. But then bizarrely, a lot of people don't seem to follow me on this one, my second favourite thing is the torture of the person who could have been the greatest. Sure. And they were the one where if there's the two people competing, only one of them can win. And so if one of them wins most of the time and the other one doesn't, there's something compelling about that, especially if you know that the team that didn't win, the player that didn't win, could have done it. That's the key essential part to me that makes it interesting, you know? It's not that they came second and they really were just the second best and, you know, that's what should have happened and this is all fair. It's like, I like the idea of you have the two people who could be king, they battle and one doesn't make it for whatever reason. And there's something very fascinating to me about trying to figure out what that is or what they did differently or what the contrast is, right? The ROX Tigers, as you alluded to, people forget this because, unfortunately, it's a byproduct of the success of the SK Telecom dynasty. They make it sound like the ROX Tigers was chopped liver and they were just the Washington Generals set up to lose against the Harlem Globetrotters every time. As I've told people many times, just go look before the playoffs when you see the regular season standings. You'll see some amazing results from the ROX Tigers. That core, again, this is one where if you wanted to make this argument, you could even make it be a counterintuitive argument, but you could make an argument they're the second best team of all time because logically they probably would have won all these tournaments if SKT didn't win them. So even though on paper you'd have to give it to someone else who had the accomplishments, I know some Chinese team or something, there's an argument that I actually think they're probably undervalued. Who were the ROX Tigers to you, and what do you think was what was interesting? What was their toil?
Man, what a topic. Like, the thing about the ROX Tigers is, like, every time I mention them, you know, you can go back and look at Twitch chat and there's all the people there, you know, like, and who knows if they were watching then, like some of them maybe just doing it by association, but like, I know I physically smile and reminisce every time I say their names and think about them. Like, I'm a romantic at heart, you know, and sentimental too. Like, there's 2 times in my esports career that I've cried, and that's when ROX Tigers finally won, you know, in 2016 summer after the final, 5 games, 2 HP Baron Steel, and they had finally won after never being able to win the big one. And I was just watching after the broadcast was over. I wept then, and when Score finally won in summer last year, right, and he came up. And it was such a moment. Like, both Atlas and I were tearing up off screen as the award ceremony was happening. But then after kind of the stadium had started to filter out, because we were pretty far away from like public transport and stuff, so people started to leave. Like 20 minutes after show was over, we were like picking up our things, and Score like is still looking around wearing his cap, you know, and he came up and like bowed to Caster John and bowed to us, like knowing what he had gone for, like living the whole history of Korean League of Legends and never winning. Like, how can you not be sentimental about stuff like that? Those are the stories that make our job worth it, you know? And for the ROX Tigers, like, I remember on the World's Analyst Desk, like, I predicted them to win the semifinal against SKT, and still to this day, that's my favorite casting memory, not casting a World Final. Like, obviously the World Final was awful last year, the 3-0 for IG, but being on Analyst Desk for that series, SKT ROX, which obviously had the MF pick come out of nowhere and was Madison Square Garden, which is a building that I knew from wrestling and respected from that more than the Staples Center, which of course everybody was focused on for the final that year. That I knew exactly what MSG meant. That building was like losing its mind for an amazing series. And I picked them to win, and they lost the series 3-2. And I said on the Analyst Desk, you know, the ROX Tigers, this team that famously was players that came together with no sponsor, who had played in real hardship, but there had been real times where they couldn't even pay for air conditioning because their sponsors had fallen through. Like, they were what League of Legends isn't anymore, which is the friends come together and you try to win the title. Like, that's what they represented for that era. And they would always get so close and then lose to SKT again and again. And that was, of course, their Achilles heel, is they were unbelievably dominant regular season, would be seeded into the final because that's how the system works, and then they would lose to SKT. That would happen every time. And there was good reasons and bad reasons. Like, sometimes they were choking, famously like that 3-0 G Tigers versus SKT first spring final, and that's fine. Like, it was the first one. They weren't so good in 2015 summer. Hojin was starting to really kind of show his inability to be a super competitive jungler at that time, even though he was actually pretty decent at Worlds, all things considered, that year. And then Peanut came in, and then Peanut had never played a best of 5 before he played in the spring final of 2016. So they lost that one 3-1, and he was very out-jungled. And then finally they avoided SKT because Score had one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen in the semifinal against SKT in their reverse sweep. KT reverse swept SKT with Score playing out of his mind. And they finally won, you know, and it was hard, and Peanut didn't play particularly well in that series. But they finally won that big one, which obviously very emotional. So I sat there on the World's Analyst Desk, and I tweeted about this, but There's a full VOD of that series that starts like 17 minutes before. It's like the countdown with all the music playing, the random dubstep or EDM or whatever they had in the playlist. And I still remember, I started listening to it and I was instantly back in Madison Square Garden preparing for that big match, because it was the biggest part of my casting career, was being on that analyst desk. And I've burned in my memory because it was such an amazing series. But on the analyst desk afterwards, I said, the ROX Tigers was a fairy tale story. And it's been like watching a movie. And in the movie, the good guys win and the ROX Tigers win. But this isn't a movie. This is sport. And SKT were too good on the day. And I sit by that. Like, the ROX was so good and their story was so amazing. And they were so lovable because they were obviously a very exuberant bunch and they made for great content. And OGN was great at bringing out personalities from those players. But they also played the game in the way I like the game to be played. I loved EDG 2015. I loved ROX Tigers 2016. I loved aggressive teams that knew how to get things done quickly. Even though SKT was ultra dominant, they were always a backseat team waiting for the inferior teams to make a mistake. ROX liked to flex in your face and be like, by the way, we're going to smash you because we're better than you. And that was always, to me, the most attractive style of League of Legends.
Surely also can't be a coincidence that those styles somewhat mesh together to perform a great rivalry, right?
Sure. I mean, that's why it was so, but also what it represented, right? Like, if you don't know anything about Korea, SKT is like one of the biggest corporations and one of the biggest dynasties versus we couldn't afford air conditioning and all of our sponsors randomly don't pay us. Like, it was the most power imbalance.
SKT is definitely the kid who has the rich dad who's kind of like a little bit of the douchebag in the movie, and you want him to fill. But as you say, it's real life, unfortunately. Sometimes that guy can win.
And that's what happened in that World semifinal. And Jacob Wolf's story was already out by then about how they were likely to break up. And like, it was pretty obvious that team would never play again. And sadly for the narrative, they played in Kesper Cup and won that, which of course was meaningless right afterwards. But I like to pretend they never played again after that. And it was like, it was that ostensibly kids or sports movie, which had the twist ending of they didn't win. Because they didn't win the big one. They never fulfilled their potential. They couldn't be clutch in big matches more often than not. Like, they should have won much easier against KT in that final, but they weren't able to do so. At least they got the win in the end. But ROX were very easy on the eyes, very aggressive. They had players who were really good at picking up the slack. But in terms of how they played, because a lot of people have to talk about ROX but didn't watch them. Like, ROX were about Peanut. Like, Peanut was the player who led everything in terms of, I'm going to go over here. But they just had a very unselfish lineup that would back him up. Like, Kuro's job was to laser minion waves, get 4 out of 6 CS, and then make sure Peanut could counter jungle. Like, they were very jungle focused in how they played. And speaking to Gorilla, who's a good personal friend, I just asked him, I was like, how do the comms work? Because, like, they had the buffless game where famously Peanut stole every red and blue buff from Flawless, who's now over in China, in a game. That's never happened before and never happened since. And he's like, well, Peanut just says I'm going in, and then people back him up. And that's the kind of team they were. And they knew how they wanted to play, and they played super aggressively, and they applied pressure, and they did it in style. So they were a one-off because they had the perfect narrative. But I know narrative is like this like dirty word, right? People talk about how
it's often used in a derogatory context, I notice.
But narrative just means story. Like, the story of this team was endlessly compelling because you could imagine what it would be like for them, and they went through hardship. And I know I'm biased because I identify with hardship and losing, and I think that, to me, that should be the thing that most people identify with. Like, people want to be winners, but most people lose. Most people don't get.
It's a lot more human to be the guy who loses than the god who always wins.
Exactly. There's one winner and 9 losers in the LCK in terms of teams, right? But when you break it out to players, and staff and fan bases, yes, of course, fan base is different because SKT has dominant fan base, but it's very easy to understand what it means to lose because in different parts of our life, we know what it means to lose. So at the end of the day, like, they were amazing upstart story. They had an amazing team story. They played the game in such a vibrant way, but they could never rise. And it's possible that their style by the end was flawed, because I think Kuro started to define his style as I'm only Peanut's backup support. And whenever it was a big game, he would overthink his laning phase, especially against Faker, and just make huge mistakes that he didn't make against smaller teams. So I think it's one of those questions where someone's like, do people over-romanticize ROX Tigers? The answer is yes and no. Like, if they kept going for years, I think they would have had roster changes. But you'll never get as perfect a story as what they were in 2016, you know?
Sure. The last team I wanted to ask about is a little bit more of a gamble in both regards. Maybe this actually ends up being the part years later where they're like, why do you ask about that team? Nothing even happened. Or maybe this is the moment where you make some epic prediction. I don't know. So it is going to be the Griffin team that we have now, because here's a team where, I mean, in theory, they're coming up on what on paper could be their third straight title, except they haven't won a title yet. So they're the interesting team for me in the last era. You know, I know people still like SK Telecom and the super team, and they wanted to see what happened with the KT guys. But for me, as soon as the Griffin team came on the scene, such an interesting style. Again, totally fresh faces that we didn't know before in the LCK. Who is this team to you? And obviously, this is the gamble part, but do they go on and become a dynasty? Do they become a team that deserves to be mentioned after SK Telecom, ROX, you know, as we're listing off the greats of the, let's say, the Mount Rushmore of career in that sense? Will they become one, do you think?
Very interesting question, given that we're at a kind of turning point for them. I think they were, even more so than how relatable the ROX Tigers story was, it's lost a bit that these were established players before, you know, they came under one banner. Like, Prey obviously was already an LCK champion. Gorilla was already a world's representative, and like, he was who the team was built around, because he stepped down from Nudge and Shield to, you know, head up what was at the time a challenger team that was quickly promoted into LCK spring 2015. The story last year was the most unbelievable one. That's the one where it feels like it really is scripted, because they got promoted from challengers and almost like perfected LCK, right, in their first split, which, given how much infrastructure had shifted between 2015, 16 and 2018, like in terms of how much support structure and wages and stuff there is around Korea, which did develop a lot. Like, it was an unbelievable story. And I tried very hard to keep the lid on what Griffin were doing in the first round robin of summer last year. Like, I didn't want to kind of overinflate them before they had really been tested, because their schedule started easy and got harder as the first round robin went on. But they kept knocking off teams, doing it in creative ways. They were one of the first teams to start to, you know, play the non-AD carries bot lane, and really, you know, Viper could just play everything. Like, he was playing Kled bot lane randomly one day, and he's a great Vladimir player. Like, they were really challenging what League of Legends could be, but they were also challenging, like, who the hell are all these rookie players, and how are they beating all of these players over here we spent 7 years building up? It was unbelievable. Like, it just felt like something was happening in front of my eyes that, like, Occam's razor suggests I was dreaming more than it was actually really happening. It was an amazing ride for them. And they went on to lose the summer final in a close series where very clearly they got into their own heads. And I think if CV Max could have it over, he wouldn't have been so visibly angry and like fiery on you can go back and watch those VODs. I think it's game 3 or 4. They lose game 3 and they were 2-1 up at the time. And he's like basically getting in the players' faces and stuff. And like, as a rookie team, like, you know, who am I to say for how they usually did their feedback loops? But they seemed shook after that, you know, and they went on to lose that final, which, you know, shit happens. Maybe that's not the end of the day, but then they lost to Gen G from there. And now the narrative shifted. And in a weird way, after Rift Rivals especially, but even after Spring, you know, like especially with how they lost in Spring, where they started Spring as easily the best team in the world. And the easy story was that because they were beating IG and Fnatic in scrims around World Finals, that like they could have been the best team in the world for like 4 months. That didn't matter. But we again got to a big game and Griffin lost. And then we went over to Rift Rivals and they lost a game there as well. That was And it all kind of fits into this narrative that was kind of started by Kingzone the year before. Because by the time Kingzone lost at Rift Rivals to Rogue Warriors, people were like, all right, I'm done with this team. And that was like both global fans and also kind of LCK fans and Korean fans. And I think it's so easy to apply that one-to-one to Griffin, even though the shoe doesn't fit. Like Griffin are young players. Like it makes sense that it doesn't make sense they were so good so quickly, but it does make sense that they weren't clutch yet, you know, in terms of the really biggest games. And going forward, I was actually, watching their series today. They played against, was it Kingzone today and beat them 2-0, but finally starting to incorporate their new top laner, Doran. Like, I think what happened with Griffin, my impression on them is that, the first split happened and that's just kind of a beautiful mess of them being able to adapt to the new meta that evolved them. And a lot of teams first underestimate them and then like them actually developing a lot and getting a lot of great scrims and improving during summer, but ultimately not being able to be clutch because they were a young team. I think the spring story is a bit separate in that they were really, really good at the start of spring, but started to fall away. I started doing kind of like VOD review streams by the end there, and I'm like, I'm not seeing Griffin in the same eyes that other people are, because they started to slow down a lot and they started to not have as coherent plans about how they wanted to play the game, but they would always win team fights because their team fighting was so amazing. Like people remember that famous interview where CB Max talked about like their wordless comms and like how they had this like brain link to be able to play the game in a different way, which sounds very like flowery and like, sure, mate, I guess you're winning. But the end result, which is the team fights, were always so impressive.
Sure.
That you were just like, okay, well, whatever. But like, yep, you guys, like, how could you ever lose after 35 minutes? You're coming back from 8K goal disadvantages, or you're just winning because you're better. But then the final happened and they had got in their own heads. They decided the only way they could win was Talia Pantheon and they couldn't team fight. And I'm sitting there being like, okay, but like 6 weeks ago, you were the gods of this. Like 3 weeks ago, you were so good at this still. And now what happened between these 2 points that you decided you couldn't do anything else? Like it's almost like with all the time to scrim in between. And I think Griffin is a team that over scrim. I remember I kind of got to befriend is not the wrong word, but to some degree befriend Viper. He speaks good English in their first split last year. And they were still scrimming all the way through Worlds. And I was like, okay, but why don't you have a holiday? Like you guys aren't playing again until I guess Casper Cup if it happens. But, they were still hardcore scrimming all the way through there. My guess is that during, the gauntlet they weren't involved in, they started to lose scrims through whatever quirk, whether that was player performance or burnout or meta, I can't know. And then eventually got to the point where only Talia Pantheon worked, and then they lose running back to Talia Pantheon, which was the worst part about when they ran it a second time after it didn't work. And I'm like, come on, guys, like for a year, the 2 splits, team fighting is what you've got, and you're choosing comps that can't team fight. Like that's not what these comps do. And you're just, you showed your hand already. Like it's not going to work the second time. And it definitely didn't. Like it was very discouraging as a analyst. You're like, oh, like how is this the end? Like it almost feels like a Deus Ex Machina or Deus, like a completely nonsensical ending to what that series should have been. And so I think it's very easy to jump off that hype train. But in summer, Griffin have been a lot more normal in most of their performances. Like they've been up and down just like all the other teams. They haven't been like, look over here, it's Griffin, the best team in the world, and before they've got a title. They've also made a big change in how their team works with Doran coming in, and they've very identifiably changed how they play the game. So I think everyone wanted to talk about who and what Griffin was, but didn't necessarily have the lexicon to do so. Like Griffin was a team that played jungle-focused game, and the jungler went mid lane a lot. Like that's how Griffin found most of their success, especially in 2019 spring, was Chovy and Tarzan's power level, either Chovy manicured or Tarzan manufactured. They got to a good spot. They came together, and then they took over the map, was basically how they played the game. But in summer, they haven't played Chovy Tarzan style at all. Like they've actually been it's almost like they're not on talking terms. If you look back at the games, they're not playing the same style together. They've tried to diversify their styles, first with Sword, putting him on a lot of Jace and trying to see how that works. And now with Doran, who's just a top lane carry player, like a young, aggressive solo queue prodigy top laner. And they're trying to find different ways to play the game. And I think that has led to a lot of poor performances from them. But maybe that makes sense with how much they're trying to reinvent what they were. Because before it was Sword plays the most OP initiator. And as long as it has a good laning phase and hasn't been nerfed enough, he'll do fine. And then his TPs and his initiations are good. But eventually,
do you think there was a bit of
what
you said? Do you think there was a bit of the Kuro syndrome there, where like it's because the problem is even when you give props to someone like him, it's like he does a great job for a player who's not supposed to be a great player, and the others are all really good, and he's just playing Scion or whatever. Like you can limit yourself by thinking that's all you are, right?
I think there's a degree of that. But the difference is that Kuro was a flair player when he wasn't playing against Faker. Like, he did play a lot of one-off champions. If you look at his Games of Legends for 2016 Spring and Summer, he would always have a very wide champion pool with a lot of one-offs. And if he could play whenever a new champion came out, he'd just play it really quickly. ROX Tigers picked up new champions really quickly. And sometimes you're like, man, Kuro, you're popping off on this champion. Sometimes like, oh no, like you can't actually play that. Like, he was happy to try things.
Okay.
But when he faced Faker, it was like he could get distracted by his own shadow and nameplates got to him. And he was a completely different player against Faker than he was against the entire other field. He got in his own head. Was the only way I could see from the outside. Meanwhile, Sword isn't that good at mechanically clicking his buttons compared to Keen, Summit, the real top tier of Korean top laners, Nogari as well. Like, when they started giving him counter picks, Riven into Aatrox, for example, like Keen was able to beat him on reverse matchups. Like, Griffin's style before Chovy became of age, because Chovy was 17 halfway through spring season last year, so he didn't even play in challengers much. He came into the LCK. Rather was supposed to be starter, who's now on Flash Rules and was at MSI, not going to be at Worlds. Spoilers if you don't follow LMS. Rather and Sword were both role players, and Viper would play hyper carries. Like, that's the way how they played before. Chovy being a mid lane carry first changed how they played, and they went from there, especially as Chovy matured coming into 2019. They played largely around him. But Sword all the way through was largely a role player, but those champions got heavily nerfed. Like, Urgot, Scion school of champions got removed, basically. Like, Marin, was mostly a Maokai Rumble player, right? When you think of 2015
Sure.
SK2. So I think this is the team that I love. But when it came to Worlds, he also busted out the Fiora, and he was the MVP of that champion. He could play those other picks. Meanwhile, Sword really is Scion, Urgot, Initiator champions. And he can play Jace. Like, he would play the Jace, but it's the example here is a really esoteric one, but it's the first one that comes to my head, is that when we had a Fiora meta in 2016, a lot of like Smeb, for example, a lovely Fiora player. Like, if Khan plays it, like, he's a native Fiora player. But we had Cuvée play Fiora because the matchup was good, and he knew he'd be able to push and continue to push, and the team could do something with that pushing. But he was like 6-1 as Fiora in terms of win rate, but his KDA was like 1.2 compared to like a Smeb, who would be like 8 KDA and a high win rate. You know what I mean? Like, he was playing Fiora so they could have a pushing lane. And that's kind of a winning matchup eventually. And that's what Sword is on Jace. He's good at reading the map. He can't initiate on this pick. So he's like, okay, what does it do? All right, I'll read the map well, and I'll try to push up. And he won't win the skill checks against the best players very reliably, but sometimes he will, right? Because he's got a champion that's good at that. But he's good at what he's good at. And that was fine in spring because he could play stable tank pick, and then Chovy and Tarzan run away with the game and gank top or bot, and it doesn't matter what his laning phase looks like. He'll be rolling in a Scion. But that wasn't possible in summer, and to Griffin's credit, they blooded Doran. They chose a time to play him. They've stuck with him the entire time, never subbed in Sword, and they just had a really good look against Kingzone, where finally Doran looked like a part of the team in a kind of positive way. And I don't know what that's going to lead to, so it makes the prediction a little bit more, unfounded and speculatory. But I looked at the Griffin today and I was like, okay, so you always had to exist in a paradigm where your top lane was this. I don't have enough data to know whether Doran makes sense if the meta suddenly changed back to tanks top, but he does fit what a top laner needs to be better than what you had before. Your other pieces are generally good with some small flaws around. For example, Viper's late game team fighting isn't super hot, especially recently, but Chovy hasn't been in as good form, but his laning is still good. I think Griffin will get there. I think Griffin could definitely win LCK Summer, which would have sounded bold 3 weeks ago when it didn't work with Sword that well, and then Doran looked like a real rookie, and you're like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen here. But just because you're asking today, and you've got to make a prediction based on what you can see, I give them points for trying to change, because they would have always had a logical ceiling, I feel like, with Sword in the roster. And I can't know for sure that with Doran there, it'll get better. But credit to them for not just being like forcing what that worked before. Like some teams have gone from being OP to terrible because they had mid-jungle synergy and they ran mid-jungle synergy from 1st to 10th, if you know what I mean. But Griffin are trying to work out something new, and I don't know where that will end, but it's starting to come together from my perspective. So the talent on this roster is still very, very impressive. And Tarzan, for example, like he really is kind of like a next level jungler, even if he hasn't looked like it so much in summer. So I have a feeling that they will be remembered fondly as performers rather than chokers. But just like Doublelift's empty trophy case for so much of his career, and then now everyone laughs and memes about like that, I think my instinct is that will be how people look back on Griffin. But who's to say, right? I'm just an informed analyst, I guess.
At the end of this interview, do you have a final message or somebody you want to say hello to or thank?
So many people along the way to thank. Thank you to everyone in my career who gave me the time of day and a platform. I've already said my thank yous to Christopher, but Susie and Eric, or Doa, as you might know more commonly, like, for being so welcoming and really bringing me to Korea and pushing me to be better. Thank you to all the fans who have always been so supportive in your own way. Like, thankfully, I was always someone who knew to anticipate that the new face wouldn't necessarily be beloved on the first day, and also could look at this guy sucks kind of texts and like work out where the actionable things were and what things I couldn't change. Like, if you hate my voice, like, I'm still me, so I can't change that, but I can get better and I can be reflective on kind of other pieces of feedback. I don't need it to always be positively framed in order to learn. But thank you to everyone out there that's been so supportive and helped me. Like, without the fan side, whatever good work I did, I wouldn't have cast a world final without the fans being so supportive and there being so much of a groundswell behind me. So thank you to those people. Thank you to my parents for being supportive of doing a 5.5-year degree, doing a 2.5-year apprenticeship, and then throwing it to the side for a dream. Not everyone gets that. My biggest takeaway from being a school counselor was that you just assume everyone had your upbringing, right? Like, everyone kind of starts there, but then you talk to parents who are like, I don't really believe in school, and you kind of understand how that could have, shaped the kid who's struggling's kind of time at school, and not everyone has the support that I had. So I do thank them a lot for what they provided me. And it's been an amazing ride, like, I definitely had to come from a different place. Like, I didn't have the pro player identity. I didn't have Riot's seal of approval, but I just tried to do it my way, and it's not the way everyone else would have done it, but I'm happy that I got to hear. It feels almost like the Reflections is a moment to reflect, but I'm not going to keep too many moments like this.
This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, Dane Cuskley, Dean Tanglis, Chi Mao, JDubs, NateDOhDoubleG, Peter the Feeder, Tobias Bernasconi, and a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion and Mohammed, Alabdul, Razzaq, Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to ask me a question in my monthly Patreon AMA. Would you like teasers on upcoming content that I'm doing? Maybe you want to take part in a discussion directly with me? Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description below.